The first time I noticed him, he was standing at the very edge of our yard, half hidden behind the leaning fence, like he wasn't sure if he was allowed to exist on this side of the grass. His hands were shoved deep into his pockets and his shoulders curved inward as though the afternoon breeze carried something heavier than wind. Most children his age run shouted through stones or claimed space the way young hearts often do. But he didn't. He stood there quietly, eyes drifting over the rusted swing set, then toward me, then down again, as if he had already learned to make himself smaller than the world required. If slow, quiet stories speak to you, you can subscribe. Only if it feels natural. Our town was the kind of place where everything settled into routine, where fathers came home tired and mothers moved through rooms like they were carrying old memories on their backs. My house lived mostly in silence, not the peaceful kind, just the kind where everyone learned to speak in lowered voices so the walls wouldn't stir. I used to count the creaks in the floorboards because they sounded more honest than anything else. In a place where noise felt dangerous, the quiet boy next door somehow fit right in. I was sitting on the back steps that day picking at the chipped paint when he finally looked up. Not fully, just enough for me to catch the flicker of curiosity in his eyes. He didn't smile. I didn't either. We just held that strange moment between us, like two kids who weren't sure what they were allowed to want. Then my mother called my name from inside, her voice already tired. When I glanced back at him after answering her, he had disappeared, leaving only the tall grass swaying where he'd stood. Over the next few weeks, I'd catch glimpses of him at odd times. Sometimes at the far end of the street, kicking a pebble slowly down the cracked pavement. Sometimes sitting alone on the curb with a book balanced on his knees. Always quiet, always watchful, as if he was visiting life rather than living in it. The adults in town said he came from a difficult house, which was their gentle way of saying they didn't really know and didn't want to. They dismissed his presence the way people sometimes do when kindness would require effort. He's not family, I heard once. He's just around, but I kept noticing that. Whenever my world felt a little heavier, he was there, never close enough to intrude, never far enough to be gone. One late afternoon, when the sky looked like a sheet of dull silver, he wandered into our yard again. I was sitting beneath the old elm tree, this time tracing shapes in the dirt with a thin stick. He stopped a few feet away, shifting his weight like he wasn't sure if I'd chase him off. "You can sit," I said without looking up, my voice barely louder than the rustle of leaves. He hesitated, then lowered himself onto the grass, knees drawn close, elbows resting on them. We didn't speak for a while. It felt like the kind of silence that belonged to people who understood it wasn't a punishment. Eventually I asked his name. He said it quietly, almost apologetically, as though offering something breakable. I told him mine. He nodded, then went back to studying a small patch of clover by his feet. There was something gentle about the way he touched the ground, fingertips brushing the leaves with more care than most people used for fragile things. I remember thinking he handled the world like it might bruise if he wasn't careful. A few days later he appeared again, standing beside our fence with that same quiet uncertainty. There was a loud thud inside my house, a dropped pot maybe, or a cupboard slammed shut too hard. He flinched sharply, shoulders jerking up as if bracing for impact. I pretended not to notice, but something under my ribs tightened. "You okay?" I asked him. He nodded too quickly. "Yeah." The way he said it made the air feel colder. Over time I learned his patterns. He never stepped inside anyone's doorway, not even ours. He always lingered near exits like he needed an escape route. And every time a voice anywhere nearby rose above normal volume, even in laughter, he tensed, first listened, second relaxed, last. At the time I didn't fully understand what that meant. I just knew it wasn't something a child should carry. But even with those shadows clinging to him, he had a calm way of filling the space around him. When we sat under the elm tree or walked the short stretch of road between our houses, it felt like the noise in my head softened. In a home where silence often felt heavy, his silence felt different, lighter, like a blanket rather than a weight. I remember one afternoon clearly. I was holding a small ceramic figurine, a tiny bird my grandmother had given me before she passed. Its wing had a crack running through it, so I was afraid to put it down. He noticed me struggling and reached out his hand, slowly, palm open. "I won't drop it," he said. His voice held a softness I didn't expect. I placed the little bird in his hand, watching as his fingers curled carefully around it. He held it like it mattered, like he understood fragile things better than most people. "Does it hurt?" he asked suddenly. "What?" "When something cracks." I didn't know if he meant the figurine or something else entirely. Neither of us pushed for an answer. Days turned into weeks, and seeing him at the fence became something I looked for without realizing it. I'd pretend I wasn't waiting, but my eyes always drifted toward the yard around the same hour each day. His presence didn't demand anything from me, and there was a quiet comfort in that. It felt like having a small light in a long hallway. You didn't need to stare at it to feel less alone. Still, one question lingered in my mind more and more as I got to know him. Why did he move through the world like someone expecting the floor to break beneath him? Why did he keep looking at our house with that strange mix of longing and caution? And why did a boy who supposedly wasn't family understand our home's unspoken hurts better than the people living inside it? I didn't have answers then, but I knew this: he wasn't just the boy next door anymore. He was the quiet presence that kept showing up when the world felt sharp, the small comfort I pretended not to rely on, the hand I didn't yet realize I would one day reach for without thinking. And even in those early moments before the storms, before the rumors, before the night everything changed, a part of me already knew he wasn't wandering close by accident. Something in both of us had recognized the other, even if neither of us understood what that meant yet. Our house had its own way of breathing, slow, heavy, like every wall carried the memory of voices it no longer wanted to hear. By the time evening settled, the air grew thicker with my father's tired footsteps and my mother's long drawn-out sighs, the kind that made you pause before entering a room. I used to think all families were like that, moving quietly around each other as though sound itself was something fragile, easily broken. But the older I grew, the more I noticed how silence seemed to swallow everything before it had the chance to become real conversation. It was during those evenings when shadows stretched thin across the floor, and no one wanted to speak first, that I found myself listening for him, not intentionally at first, and certainly not in any way I would have admitted aloud. But somewhere between the clatter of my father's keys tossed onto the table and the soft drag of my mother's slippers down the hallway, I started waiting for that familiar, careful knock on the back door. It was always the same. Two gentle taps, a pause, then one more, like he didn't want to startle anyone, like he'd practiced a way of knocking that would make him easy to ignore if needed, and somehow that made me rise from my seat every time. He never stepped inside without asking. Most days he didn't step inside at all. He'd stand at the threshold, leaning slightly against the doorframe, hands in his pockets, dirt on his shoes, as if he'd walked slowly just to get here. Sometimes he looked tired, sometimes distracted, but always kind, always present in a way few people around me had ever been. "Hey," he'd say, barely louder than the hum of the refrigerator behind me. "Hey." I'd answer as though we'd spoken the same greeting for years. We didn't need more. He wasn't the type of boy who filled silence with unnecessary words, and I wasn't the type who expected him to. His presence alone softened the edges of the rooms behind me, rooms that normally felt like they were holding their breath. With him standing there, something eased. The house seemed less alert, less guarded, as though his quiet had its own kind of warmth. He'd hand me little things sometimes. A comic he thought I'd like, a press leaf he found behind his house, a tiny handmade bracelet of twisted thread that he claimed wasn't meant for anyone in particular but somehow fit my wrist perfectly. Small gestures, almost fleeting, yet each one settled into a part of me I didn't realize had been empty. But the strangest part, the part I couldn't understand even then, was how quickly he left. He always watched the light outside like it was ticking down to something only he could see. 5 minutes, 10 at most. He'd shift from one foot to the other, glance over his shoulder, and say I should go, even if the sun was only beginning to tilt toward the western sky. Stay a little longer. I'd say, not quite pleading, but close enough for him to notice. His eyes softened. They always did. "I can't." He never said why. And I never asked. Not really. I was too young to understand how some people learn to fear dusk long before they learn to fear anything else. Too young to see how shadows could hold memories someone didn't want to revisit. When he left, the house swallowed me back up. My father's voice drifting from the living room, my mother's soft, resigned humming from the kitchen, the click of utensils, the flicker of the old ceiling light. I'd sit on the top stair, knees pressed to my chest, feeling the weight of the quiet settle again. And even though I didn't want to admit it, I'd count the hours until the next gentle knock. Sometimes he showed up with dust on his cheek, the kind you get from running a hand along old wood. Once he had a faint mark on the side of his neck, not a bruise exactly, but something that made me pause. When I asked what happened, he shrugged it off. "Tree branch," he said. I wasn't looking where I was going. But his eyes didn't match the light tone of his voice, and the lie sat awkwardly between us. He changed the subject quickly, pointed to something in my hand, asked about my day, mentioned a squirrel he'd seen doing something ridiculous. Anything to shift attention away from himself. I didn't push. I hadn't yet learned that silence can sometimes be its own kind of confession, and still, whenever I opened the door to him, I saw the faintest ease in his shoulders, as though being near our cracked walls and mismatched furniture offered him a different kind of safety, not perfect, but better than the one he knew. There were evenings when he didn't show up at all. Those nights felt longer. The house felt louder. My father's sighs heavier, my mother's steps slower. I found myself glancing toward the back door with a tightness in my chest I didn't want to call worry because I didn't feel like I had the right to worry about someone the world insisted was not mine. But it lingered anyway, a quiet ache tucked beneath my ribs, until the next day, when he'd appear again as if nothing had changed. Daylight made him gentler, more at ease. But as the sun dipped behind the row of houses, a different tension settled into him. His hands fidgeted more. His eyes darted toward the street. His steps grew quicker. Once he left so suddenly he didn't even finish the sentence he'd been saying. I remember watching his back retreat down the sidewalk, shoulders stiff, breath uneven. I wanted to run after him to ask what chased him so relentlessly at sunset, but I stayed where I was. Because a part of me sensed that whatever followed him when the sky darkened was not something he was ready to name. Not yet, not with me. On the rare occasions he did step into our house, he kept close to the doorway. He looked around like he was memorizing where each exit was just in case. And though he never said it, I could tell our silence, the one that made me feel boxed and felt gentler, to him than the silence he carried. One evening as he leaned against the doorframe with the last of the golden light touching his face, he said something I didn't fully understand then. "You have a quiet house," he murmured. "But it's not the scary kind." I didn't know there were different kinds of quiet until he said that, and I didn't know how to ask him what it sounded like. He left before the sky. Fully dimmed footsteps, light breath, quick disappearing around the corner like the dark itself was waiting for him, and I stood there in the fading light wondering why someone who brought so much calm into my world ran so fast from the approaching night, wondering what shadows followed him home, wondering what he heard in silence that I didn't, things I would soon learn, things that would change the way I saw him forever. That winter arrived earlier than anyone expected, not with snow, not with the soft hush of white mornings, but with a biting cold that slipped through the cracks of our doors and settled inside the walls like it intended to stay. The sky stayed the same dull shade of pewter for weeks, and every breath felt like it lingered long enough to frost over. Our house, already quiet most days, grew quieter still. Everyone moved around wrapped in their own thoughts, carrying invisible distances between them. My father worked later shifts, coming home with his coat stiff from the cold, shoulders tight enough to warn us not to ask about his day. My mother stayed curled near the small heater in the living room, flipping through magazines she didn't read. She hummed sometimes, but even that felt thinner, like she was humming so she wouldn't forget the sound of her own voice. I tried to stay out of the way, drifting between rooms like someone visiting a house that wasn't theirs. It was during those long gray afternoons that I began noticing small things left by the back door. The first appeared on a Monday, a paperback book with a worn spine and a tiny leaf tucked between its pages. I found it resting against the doorframe, no note attached. When I opened the door, the yard was empty, the tall grass barely moving. I knew immediately who had left it. The second gift came 2 days later, a scarf, deep blue, a little frayed at the edges, but soft and warm when I pressed it to my cheek. Again, no one was there when I opened the door, but I could picture him placing it gently on the step, glancing over his shoulder before slipping away. He always moved like someone afraid of being seen, even when he wasn't doing anything wrong. By the end of the week, a small packet of tea appeared, the kind that smelled faintly of mint and something floor. I held it between my hands longer than necessary, surprised at how much warmth such a simple thing could hold. A strange kind of comfort settled in my chest, one I hadn't felt from my own family in a long time. When I finally saw him the next afternoon, he was standing across the yard, kicking at a patch of frozen earth with the toe of his shoe. I walked toward him, the scarf wrapped around my neck, the book tucked under my arm. He looked up, a small flicker of something, relief maybe, crossing his face before he masked it with his usual quiet expression. "You didn't have to bring these," I said. He shrugged lightly. "They were just things lying around." The lie was gentle, almost tender. His eyes drifted to the scarf, and for a moment I thought he might acknowledge it. But he didn't. Instead, he knelt down and picked up a stray twig, twirling it between his fingers, as if the world depended on that simple movement. Still, I pressed, "I liked them." This time he smiled, but only a little, the kind of smile that doesn't quite reach the eyes but still means something. "Good," he murmured. Then he tossed the twig aside and stood up again, dusting his palms against his jeans like he needed to busy his hands. I tried to ask him why he left them at the door instead of giving them to me directly. But each time I opened my mouth, the answer seemed too delicate to force out. Something about his posture, the way he shifted from foot to foot, made me feel that if I pushed too hard he might disappear back into whatever shadows kept tugging at him. The days grew colder and the house somehow grew even quieter. My father's heavy coat stayed draped over a chair longer each night. My mother spent more time staring at the television without really watching it. The heater rattled like it was struggling to keep its promise. and in all that fading warmth the boy's small gifts seemed to glow brighter. Sometimes he left things that made me laugh, a lopsided snowman drawn on notebook paper even though we hadn't seen snow in weeks. A handful of smooth river stones arranged into a little face. Once a single cookie wrapped carefully in foil still warm enough to make me wonder how fast he'd run from his kitchen to mine. I tried to catch him in the act, waiting near the window or pretending to read on the back steps. But he always seemed to know when I was watching. The gifts only appeared when I'd given up and walked away. It was as though he wanted kindness to arrive without the weight of being seen. One evening I opened the door to find a small jar filled with dried lavender tied with a piece of twine. The scent drifted up soft and calming. I looked around the darkening yard and spotted him at the fence, hands already retreating into his pockets as though he'd been caught doing something he shouldn't. "You don't have to keep doing this," I called out gently. He didn't move at first. Then he lifted his gaze and something vulnerable passed through his expression. "It's nothing," he said. "Just, winter feels cold." His words hung in the air and I felt a quiet ache settle inside me. Not because of the cold but because I sensed he wasn't talking about the weather at all. His eyes had that distant look again, the one that made me wonder what else he was trying to warm, who else he wished he could take care of. I stepped closer, careful not to frighten him. "Why us?" I asked softly. "Why my family?" He looked away, focusing on the dying grass beneath his feet. "You're nice to me," he said simply. "Nicer than most." There was a loneliness tucked inside his voice that didn't belong on a boy his age. And although he didn't explain further, he didn't need to. Some truths don't require full sentences to be understood. Before I could respond, he straightened abruptly and glanced toward his house. The sky was dimming. Dusk had set its quiet mark on everything around us. I watched the familiar tension fill his shoulders, the way he measured the darkness like it held secrets only he knew. "I should go," he whispered, voice already fading. I wanted to reach out to pull him back for just a moment longer, but I didn't. Instead, I nodded, letting him disappear across the yard, feet crunching lightly over the frozen ground. Long after he left, I stood at the doorway, lavender jar in hand, breathing in the scent he'd chosen to leave behind. My house felt cold, yes, but somehow because of him it felt a little less lonely. And as I closed the door, I couldn't stop wondering what made him care for a family who barely knew how to care for each other. What made him reach toward us when no one had ever claimed him as theirs? Questions without answers hung in the air that winter. Questions that would follow us long after the snow we never saw. The morning it happened, the air felt unusually still, like the world hadn't quite decided to wake up yet. Frost clung to the edges of the window, turning the glass pale and hazy. I was sitting at the kitchen table, slowly tracing circles on the cover of the notebook he had lent me a week earlier. I kept flipping through the pages, pretending to reread the same paragraph, though my eyes weren't really focused. Part of me was waiting, not impatiently, just expectantly, in that quiet way you wait for something you don't want to admit matters. A soft, familiar knock tapped against the back door. Too gentle to belong to anyone else. I opened the door to find him standing there, hair still damp from the morning air, cheeks flushed from walking. He smiled, or tried to, but the smile didn't quite lift the way it usually did. His shoulders were drawn tighter than the cold alone could explain. Still, he stepped forward and held out his hand for the notebook, as if returning things between us was part of some unspoken ritual we'd both learned to follow carefully. "I finished it," I said, placing it into his palm. "You were right about the ending." He nodded, shifting his grip on the notebook. That was when I saw it, not boldly, not clearly, but just enough to make my breath catch for a moment. A faint bruise lay across his wrist, half covered by his sleeve, a smear of muted purple fading toward yellow. It wasn't fresh. It wasn't accidental. It was the kind of bruise that had a story behind it, one he didn't want to tell. Before my mind could stop my mouth, I pointed gently. "What happened there?" His reaction was immediate, quick, practiced. He tugged the sleeve down, covering the mark with a movement that was almost as smooth to familiar, like he'd done it hundreds of times. "Oh, that just hit it on a door." He said it lightly, as if the words had been waiting on the tip of his tongue, as if he'd been ready for the question long before I asked it. But his eyes didn't match the tone of his voice. There was a heaviness there, something dimmed, something tired, something that didn't belong on a boy who should have been worrying about homework and scraped knees, not bruises carefully hidden in winter sleeves. He looked past me into the kitchen, but not at anything in particular, more like he was staring at a place far away, somewhere I could not follow. "You sure?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, gentle. "Yeah," he replied quickly, nodding once. "Yeah, it's nothing." The way he said nothing made it feel like everything. He shifted his weight, and for the first time I noticed the stiffness in his posture, the way he held himself. as if every movement needed permission. Even the notebook seemed heavy in his hands, as if he was bracing himself for something I couldn't see. I felt a strange pull in my chest, then something sharp and protective, something unfamiliar but certain. Like a thread had been tugged somewhere inside me, awakening a part of myself I didn't know existed. He rubbed his wrist absent-mindedly, as though he'd forgotten I'd seen it. His sleeve slipped again for a fraction of a second, revealing the bruise in the soft morning light. It wasn't just the color that struck me, but the shape of it, uneven, gripped, held too tightly. I opened my mouth, then closed it again. The questions tangled inside me, too many and too delicate to speak without breaking something. I didn't want him to retreat, not the way he usually did when conversations pressed too close to things he didn't want to name. Instead, I stepped aside. "You want to come in for a minute?" I asked. "It's cold out." He hesitated, and that hesitation said more than any answer could have. His eyes flicked toward the hallway behind me, toward the muffled quiet of my home, then back to the yard behind him. Whatever weighed on him, whatever pressed against his world, it made stepping through a doorway seem like crossing a boundary he wasn't sure he deserved. "I can't stay long," he finally murmured. He stepped inside anyway, settling near the door without removing his shoes. The sunlight fell in through the window at just the right angle, catching the edges of his sleeve, outlining the hidden bruise beneath the cloth. For a moment, he looked older than he was, not in years but in the weariness pulling around him. He glanced at the kitchen table, then at me. "It's a nice morning," he said softly. "It's freezing," I replied. That small smile returned, faint but genuine this time. "Yeah, but it's still nice." He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. Sometimes nice isn't about warmth. Sometimes it's just about having a moment where no one is shouting, no one is slamming doors, no one is pulling you by the wrist. We talked for a few minutes about nothing important: school, a stray cat near his porch, a science project we both pretended to dread. He kept rubbing his wrist, almost unconsciously, each time stopping himself as though the gesture might reveal more than he intended. When he said he had to go, he didn't look toward his home immediately. Instead, he paused at the threshold, fingers tightening slightly around the notebook in his hand. "Thanks," he said, though I wasn't sure what part he was thanking me for. For returning the notebook, for not pressing harder about the bruise, or for simply standing there offering a space where he didn't have to hide quite as much. He didn't wait for my reply. He slipped out into the cold air, the door closing softly behind him. I watched him walk across the yard, his steps careful, measured, as if he was preparing himself for something waiting on the other side of his fence. And as he disappeared behind his house, the question lingered in the quiet morning like a shadow that refused to fade. What kind of trouble lived behind his front door? And how many more bruises had I not seen? The storm arrived without warning, rolling over our neighborhood like a thick blanket pulled too fast across the sky. One moment the lights were humming quietly, the next they flickered twice and vanished, leaving the whole house wrapped in sudden darkness. I had been sitting in the living room listening to the soft rattle of the windows when the power died. At first I thought it would come back in a few seconds. It didn't. The quiet that followed felt heavier than the storm outside. The kind of quiet that presses against your skin, reminding you how alone you really are in a house where everyone hides in separate rooms. My parents were upstairs, their voices lost behind closed doors, and I stayed where I was, trying to steady my breath in the dimness. Without the usual glow of lamps or television, the shadows grew tall and unfamiliar, stretching across the walls like things reaching for me. I lit a candle, but its small flame only made the darkness feel deeper at the edges. The storm kept growling louder each time, and the wind scraped branches against the siding with a restless kind of desperation. I wrapped my arms around myself and sank onto the cold floor, pulling my knees closer, trying to pretend the dark didn't bother me. But it did. It always did. Minutes passed, or maybe just moments, before I heard it. A soft tapping on the window. Not sharp, not hurried. Just gentle, almost rhythmic, like someone afraid of startling me. For a second I froze. My heart thudded too loudly in my chest, and every scary story I'd ever heard crept to the front of my mind. Then the tapping came again. I stood slowly, candle trembling in my hand, and walked toward the window. The storm flashed a pale streak of lightning in the distance, illuminating the yard for a split second, and that was when I saw him. He was crouched beneath the sill, hood pulled over his head, one hand raised mid-tap. His face was half lit by the shaky beam of a small flashlight. His eyes weren't frightened, just searching. When he saw me, something in his posture softened, like he'd been holding his breath until that moment. I unlatched the window. It stuck for a second from the cold, then slid upward with a groan. He climbed in with practiced ease, swinging one leg over then the other. The flashlight's dim glow made him look almost unreal in the darkened room, like someone stepping out of a memory rather than the yard next door. "You okay?" he asked. His voice was quiet, steady. More steady than mine would have been. I didn't know where anyone was, I admitted, my whisper barely rising above the sound of rain against the glass. He nodded as if that answer made perfect sense. Then he clicked off the flashlight and sat down on the floor beside me, our shoulders nearly touching. I hadn't realized how cold I was until I felt the faint warmth coming off him, the kind of warmth that settles into a space long before words do. The storm kept rumbling outside, but somehow it sounded less threatening now. He rested the flashlight on the floor between us, the metal casing tapping lightly against the wood. His breathing was slow, steady, something to anchor myself to in the darkness. For a long time neither of us spoke. He didn't ask why I was scared. I didn't ask why he had come. It didn't feel necessary. He was there. I was there. And the house, which usually felt so hollow, suddenly felt full in a way I didn't know how to name. At one point lightning lit up the room again, stretching our shadows across the far wall. That was when I saw it, the brief flicker of relief on his face. Not comfort exactly, but something like it. He stared at the candle flame for a few seconds, then let out a breath he'd been holding too long. "Did your lights go out too?" I asked. He shook his head. "Ours are still on." "Then why did you come here?" He looked down at his hands, fingers moving restlessly against each other. His clothes were damp at the shoulders from the rain, and a few leaves clung to the bottom of his jeans. When he finally answered, his voice was quieter than before. It felt too loud at my place. I didn't know what he meant, not exactly, but I understood enough. Sometimes silence is loud in the worst ways. Sometimes a house full of people still feels empty. Sometimes darkness feels safer somewhere that isn't home. "I'm glad you came," I said softly. He glanced at me, eyes warm in the candlelight. "Me too." The floor was cold beneath us, but his presence fell across my shoulders like a blanket, steadying, familiar. I leaned back against the wall, letting my legs stretch out in front of me. He mirrored the movement, the flashlight rolling slightly until he caught it with his foot. "You want me to stay until the lights come back?" he asked. His tone was casual, but something underneath it felt cautious, as if he expected me to say no. "Yes," I said without hesitation. He nodded once, the smallest smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Okay." We listened to the storm together, candle flickering between us. He hummed quietly at one point, not a tune I recognized. Just a soft sound under his breath that made the space feel warmer. Every so often thunder rolled and I felt myself tense. Each time he shifted slightly, not enough to draw attention, but enough to remind me I wasn't alone. After a while his head tipped back against the wall. His eyes fluttered shut, not fully asleep but resting. And in that dim glow I saw it again, that strange expression of relief. As if being here in my darkened house offered him something his lit-up home could not. The power returned hours later, humming back to life with a low rising buzz. The overhead light flickered on, washing the room in pale yellow. He blinked, lifting his head, slowly adjusting to the brightness. For a moment we just stared at each other, both unsure how to break the quiet that had held us together. Then he stood, brushing dust from his hands. "I should go before they notice." There was a heaviness to that "they" that I didn't dare question yet. "Will you be okay?" I asked. He nodded, though the answer came too quickly, again like earlier with the bruise. "Yeah, I just needed to step out for a bit." He slipped out the window the same way he came in, landing lightly on the damp grass. Before leaving he looked back at me, eyes holding something unspoken, gratitude maybe, or something deeper, something he didn't have the words for. "Good night," he said. Then he ran across the yard, disappearing into the thin veil of mist the storm had left behind, and as I watched him go, one question settled into me like a quiet ache. Why did he look more relieved in my darkness than he ever looked in his own light? The whispers started softly, like everything else in our town. Did a murmured sentence here, a lowered voice there, something passed between neighbors with the same casualness as weather updates. At first I didn't pay much attention. People gossiped the way old houses creaked, constantly, predictably, and usually without meaning much. But these whispers had a sharper edge, a kind of heaviness that made people glance over their shoulders before speaking. And his name was woven into all of it. I overheard the first rumor while standing in line at the small grocery store. Two women near the spice shelf leaned close, heads tilted together. "They say his father's been gone again." "Gone where?" "Who knows? He leaves for days, weeks sometimes, poor boy." Their voices dropped then to soft for me to catch the rest, but my stomach tightened anyway. I pretended to read the label on a jar, my hands suddenly to still. Rumors in our town didn't always mean truth, but they never came from nowhere. Over the next few days the whispers grew steadier, more pointed. "Someone heard shouting last night. I saw him wandering outside in the cold. He looks tired. Something's not right in that house." Each sentence floated toward me like pieces of a puzzle no one wanted to assemble aloud. I kept pretending I wasn't listening, but every word pressed into my mind with an uncomfortable weight. Rumors stick differently when they're about someone you care about. He still showed up every afternoon just as quietly as ever. His soft knock, his quick smile, his steady presence, nothing in his behavior changed. But now when I looked at him, I started noticing things I'd ignored before. The slight shadows under his eyes. The way he tensed whenever a dog barked loudly down the street. How he always positioned himself with one ear tilted toward the direction of his home, like part of him never fully left it. I tried to push the whispers aside. But once a seed of worry is planted, it grows roots fast. One afternoon, as we sat under the elm tree beside my yard, I worked up the courage to ask. The wind carried a faint chill, shaking loose a few dry leaves that landed near our feet. He was picking at a blade of grass, tearing it into small pieces with careful, methodical movements. I watched his hands for a moment, the same hands that had placed quiet gifts at my door, the same hands that once trembled lightly during the power outage. "Hey," I said, finally, keeping my tone light, neutral. "Can I ask you something?" He looked up, brows raised slightly. "Okay," I hesitated. The question hovered on my tongue, heavier than it should have been. "I've been hearing things about your place." His eyes softened first, then dimmed. Not in surprise, but in something like resignation, as though he'd expected the question eventually. For a moment he didn't speak. The air between us thickened with the tension of everything unsaid. "What things?" he asked, though his voice already held the answer. "Just people talking. Saying your dad's not around much. Or that there's yelling." I didn't mean to pry. He interrupted, gently lifting a hand. "It's fine." But the way he said fine didn't sound fine at all. He returned to shredding the blade of grass, eyes lowered, a small crease forming between his eyebrows. I waited for him to say more, to offer something, anything. But instead he took a slow breath, then pointed across the yard at a bird hopping along the fence. "Look," he said, "that's the same one that keeps trying to build a nest in our gutter." He changed the subject so quickly it was almost seamless, almost practiced. His tone lifted slightly, his smile reappeared, soft, polite, fragile. He didn't want to talk about it. Or maybe he didn't know how. I let him shift the conversation, even though a part of me ached to pull him back to the truth. But I was afraid. Afraid that if I pushed too hard, he'd retreat again, the way he always did when shadows crept too close to him. So I nodded, watching the bird with him, pretending the world was as simple as the small creature bouncing along the fence line. When he left that evening earlier than usual, claiming he needed to help with something, at home I stood at the door longer than necessary, watching his silhouette disappear down the twilight street. His steps looked hurried yet hesitant, like he was being pulled and pushed at the same time by something unseen. The rumors kept growing in the following days. Some were vague, like I heard the back door was left open all night, and others sharper. Someone said he sleeps on the couch sometimes, or outside. No one claimed to know the truth, and no one tried to find out. They just talked the way people do when distance feels easier than concern. Whenever I saw him, though, he behaved as though everything was normal. He'd greet me with the same small smile, tell me about something he'd seen on the way over, point out shapes in the clouds, or ask about a book I was reading. His voice stayed steady, but his eyes told a different story. They held a quietness I couldn't quite interpret, not fear exactly, not sorrow, but something that sat deep and unmoving. I noticed more details now. How he carried tension in his shoulders, like invisible weights were hanging from them. How he startled at sudden sounds, even gentle ones. How he sometimes winced when stretching his arm too far. They were small things, easy to overlook, but once seen, impossible to unsee. One afternoon, while we sat on the step behind my house, he grew still, suddenly listening. His head tilted slightly, his back straightened. I followed his gaze toward his home. Nothing seemed out of place from where we sat, just the usual quiet yard, the usual sagging porch, the usual closed windows. But something in his face changed. His breath hitched the tiniest bit. "I should go," he said quickly. "It's early, I know." He didn't offer more. He simply stood, dusted off his jeans, and gave me a small nod before hurrying across the yard. I watched him until he disappeared behind his door, my worry twisting into something sharper now. Something more urgent. That night I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying every conversation, every half-hidden bruise, every hesitant smile. I thought about the rumors, about his silence when I asked about the weight he carried alone. Why wouldn't he tell me? Why wouldn't he share even a sliver of the truth? Maybe he didn't want to burden me. Maybe he didn't trust the words to come out right. Maybe he feared what would happen if he said things aloud that he spent so long keeping quiet. Or maybe, and this possibility hurt most, he had learned that some truths only make the world colder when spoken. Whatever the reason, I knew one thing. He was holding something inside himself so tightly it might break him someday. And I wasn't sure how much longer he could keep carrying it alone. The evening it happened, the house was already carrying the leftover tension of a long day. My father had come home with that tired heaviness in his shoulders, the one that made every room shrink a little. My mother tried to keep things calm, but her voice had a tremor beneath it, like something inside her was close to cracking. I sat at the dining table pretending to focus on homework, though the numbers on the page kept blurring together. I knew the air was shifting before anyone spoke, the way the walls seemed to stiffen, the way silence pressed too tightly between breaths. The argument began with something small, as these things often do. A question asked too sharply, a reply delivered too quickly. Then one voice rose, then another, and soon the whole room felt like it was vibrating. My father's tone wasn't loud, but it was heavy enough to make me flinch. My mother's words came out thin and anxious, like she was trying to hold both of us together while holding herself upright. I sat there, heart pounding, trying to make myself smaller, wishing the conversation would fade into the background hum of the house. But it didn't. It grew. It tightened. It found its way into my chest, until I couldn't swallow without feeling the sting of it. "Go to your room," my father finally said, not looking at me. The words hit harder than they should have. Maybe it was the tone. Maybe it was the way he dismissed me without a glance, as if I were part of the noise rather than someone affected by it. My throat tightened. "I didn't do anything." "That's enough," he said, sharper now. Something inside me cracked. I pushed back my chair, the legs scraping loudly against the floor, and, before either of them could stop me, I rushed out the back door. The cold evening air hit my face like a splash of water, and I didn't stop moving until I reached the old pine tree at the far end of our yard. I sank down at its base, back against the rough bark, pulling my knees to my chest. My breath came too fast, too shallow, as if the argument had followed me outside and wrapped itself around my ribs. The ground was cold and uneven beneath me, and I dug my fingers into the dry pine needles, trying to steady myself. My shoulders trembled, not from the temperature but from the weight of everything I couldn't hold together anymore. I didn't hear him approach. The grass didn't rustle. The gate didn't squeak. It was only when I felt a faint change in the air beside me that I realized someone was there. I lifted my head, swallowing hard, and saw him standing a few feet away. The boy next door. His silhouette outlined by the fading light, his face full of a quiet concern that made something inside my chest loosen unexpectedly. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't ask why I was crying, or why my breath shook, or why I had run from the house like something was chasing me. He simply walked toward me with that same gentle steadiness he always carried, lowering himself to the ground without hesitation. He sat close, not too close, not uncomfortably close, just close enough that I felt the warmth of his presence slip into the hollow spaces inside me. For a moment neither of us spoke. The wind moved through the pine branches above us, creating a soft, trembling whisper that made the world feel smaller, safer. Then, without a word, he reached for my hand. Not tentatively, not awkwardly, with a quiet certainty, like he had already decided that this was the moment to be something steady for me. His fingers wrapped around mine, warm even in the evening chill. My first instinct was to pull away, not because I didn't want the comfort, but because I wasn't used to someone offering it without condition. But he didn't let go. His grip was gentle, steady, grounding. It was the first time in my life someone had held my hand, not out of obligation or formality, but because they could see I was falling apart and wanted to keep me from slipping any further. I exhaled shakily, the tension in my shoulders slowly unwinding. His thumb brushed lightly over the back of my hand, not in a romantic way, not in a dramatic way, just a soft human reassurance. The kind of touch that said you're not alone without needing the words. We sat like that for a long time. The sky shifted from pale blue to deep indigo, the first stars appearing shyly above us. My breathing gradually steadied, matching his slow, quiet rhythm. Every time the house behind me creaked, I tensed, but his hand tightened, just enough to bring me back to the space we shared beneath the pine. "You're okay," he whispered eventually. His voice was soft, almost hesitant, as if he wasn't used to saying things meant to comfort. But the words eased something in me I hadn't realized was knotted. "I didn't mean to run out," I murmured, wiping at my eyes with my free hand. "I know." He looked at me, then really looked. "Sometimes you just need to breathe somewhere else." I hadn't expected him to understand. I hadn't expected anyone to. For a moment I studied his face, the faint shadows beneath his eyes, the tenderness hidden behind quiet expressions, the familiarity of someone who had already walked through more darkness than I knew. The boy who never stayed past dusk. The boy who hid his bruises. The boy who carried secrets like fragile glass. Yet here he was, holding my hand like he had every right to protect something inside me. "Thank you," I whispered. He shook his head lightly. "You don't have to thank me, but I did. because his presence felt like something I'd been missing for a long time, something soft and steady that didn't exist in the echoing rooms of my house. His hand felt more like family than anything I had known within those walls. As the night deepened, he shifted closer, letting our shoulders touch. It wasn't a dramatic gesture, just a quiet offering, a promise without words, and I leaned into it, letting the warmth anchor me in a way nothing else ever had. After a while, he spoke again, barely above a whisper. "You don't have to face everything alone." The words settled into me like a truth I had needed for years. And even though he didn't talk about himself, didn't speak of the whispers or his father's absences, or the nights he left his own house till late, I realized something important. He gave comfort so easily because he knew what it felt like to need it. And as he held my hand beneath the old pine tree, beneath the quiet night, beneath everything unspoken between us, I couldn't stop wondering, why did his touch feel more like home than the house I lived in? It happened on a Saturday afternoon, the kind of day where everything felt muted, like the world was wrapped in a thin layer of dust. The sky outside was pale, almost colorless, and the house was quieter than usual. My parents were both out on errands, leaving me alone with the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional crackle of the heating vents kicking in. I decided to clean my room, not because I felt particularly productive, but because the stillness made me restless. I picked up the book he had lent me the week before, the one with the creased cover and soft worn pages. I'd already finished reading it, but I hadn't returned it yet. Something about the way his notes filled the margins made me want to linger with it a little longer. His handwriting always slanted, slightly to the right, almost like it was leaning toward something it couldn't quite reach. When I opened the book to slide it onto my shelf, something slipped out and fluttered to the floor. A folded sheet of paper yellowed at the edges as if it had been handled more than once. It wasn't part of the book. I would have noticed it earlier. My first thought was that it might be one of his little doodles or a forgotten scrap of homework, but when I bent to pick it up, the paper felt different, softer, worn, important. My heart thudded once hard as I unfolded it. His handwriting filled the page, slanted, uneven, as though written in a hurry or during a moment he couldn't hold still. The words didn't begin with a greeting or a name. There was no dear or hello or any clue about who it might have been for. It simply started raw and quiet, like a thought spilled directly onto a paper. "Sometimes I wonder how long I have to stay in a place that doesn't see me." I stopped reading for a moment, breath caught in my chest. The room felt smaller, walls shifting closer, as though the letter carried a kind of weight the air wasn't used to holding. I sank onto the edge of my bed and continued. "I keep thinking about leaving. Not forever, just somewhere else for a while. Somewhere that doesn't feel so heavy all the time." My hands trembled slightly as I held the paper, not out of fear but out of something deeper, a kind of ache that settled beneath my ribs, expanding slowly. A wish he had whispered onto a page instead of aloud. I know I wouldn't be missed. Not really. People get used to not noticing things. I closed my eyes, letting those words settle. I pictured him sitting alone somewhere, pen moving quietly across the page, writing thoughts he didn't feel he could say. I imagined the dim light of his room, the distant sound of something unsettling him in the background, the uncertainty in his posture. He felt unseen, and he hadn't meant for anyone to read this. I kept reading, even though a part of me felt like I shouldn't. Sometimes I wish there was a place I could go where nobody expected anything from me, where it didn't matter if I spoke or stayed quiet, somewhere I could just rest. The simplicity of the wish made my heart tighten. He wasn't asking for anything dramatic. He didn't want escape or adventure or a new beginning. He just wanted somewhere safe, somewhere warm, somewhere to breathe without bracing. It wasn't a farewell. It wasn't a plan. It was a confession of exhaustion, quiet, lonely exhaustion that no one had bothered to notice. At the bottom of the page, he had written one last line. Smaller, lighter, almost hesitant. I wonder if it's wrong to want a different kind of home. My chest burned at that. Not in a frightening way, just in the way a truth can hurt when you realize someone you care about has been carrying too much on their own. I folded the letter slowly, carefully, as if rushing might tear it. I set it on my lap, staring at the soft crease down the middle. My thoughts tangled. 1,000 questions filled my head at once. Why had he written it? How long had it been tucked inside the book? Was it meant to be found, or had it been hidden, slipped away between pages by accident? I didn't know. What I did know was that it was intimate, private, full of a quiet pain he hadn't yet shared with anyone, not even me, despite the growing closeness between us. Should I tell him I saw it? Ask him what he meant? Offer him the comfort he hadn't asked for but clearly needed? The thought of confronting him made my stomach twist, not because I didn't want to help, but because he had always been careful with his truths. He shared them the way someone passes a fragile object slowly, only when the timing felt right, only when he trusts had the space between us. If I pushed too hard, he might retreat. If I said nothing, he might continue believing no one saw him. I placed the letter on my desk and stared at it for a long time. Outside, the wind brushed against the house, carrying the faint scent of winter. The heater hummed, unevenly filling the quiet with a soft vibration. Eventually, I slipped the letter back between the pages of the book exactly where I had found it. My fingers lingered there, tracing the edge of the paper hidden inside. I wasn't ready to return the book yet, and I certainly wasn't ready to face him with the knowledge I held, but the letter had changed something in me. It had shifted the way I saw him, deepened the understanding I already carried. He wasn't just the quiet boy next door with gentle hands and careful steps. He was someone who had learned to keep his heart tucked away, folded like that sheet of paper, out of sight, out of trouble, out of reach. I sighed, leaning back in my chair. He deserved more than the world had given him, more than the silence he was raised in, more than the coldness he had learned to accept. And as the light outside dimmed into early evening, one question lingered in my mind, gentle but insistent. Should I tell him I saw the letter, or pretend I never touched the weight of his unspoken plea? The night it happened, the air felt strange, to still, to watchful, as if the whole street was waiting for something to unravel. I had been lying in bed, turning from one side to the other, unable to fall asleep. The letter I'd found earlier in the week sat tucked safely inside my drawer, but its words still echoed in my mind. Every time I tried to close my eyes, I pictured his handwriting, slanted and uncertain, like it had been written in the dark. It must have been close to midnight when the first sound came. A sharp thud, muffled but unmistakable, echoing from the house next door. I froze, breath held, listening. A moment later, another noise followed, louder, sharper, something falling or being thrown. Then a voice rose, tense and harsh, too distorted by distance to understand, but unmistakably angry. I sat up, heart pounding. The room felt colder suddenly, as though the walls themselves had drawn in a long, uneasy breath. I pushed the blanket aside and moved to the window, lifting the corner of the curtain with trembling fingers. The porch light next door flickered weakly, casting a dim glow across the front yard. Another voice joined the first, not as loud, but strained, as if trying and failing to sound calm. Then, without warning, a sharp sound cut through the night like something breaking. I flinched, and then silence. Not peaceful silence, a heavy, hollow silence that followed noise too intense to ignore. My eyes stayed fixed on the house, waiting for another shout, another movement, anything that might tell me what was happening behind those walls. But nothing came, just the faint hum of wind against the gutter. And then I saw him. The front door opened just a crack at first, spilling a sliver of weak yellow light onto the porch. He stepped out slowly, almost cautiously, as if he feared the ground might shift beneath him. His small frame looked swallowed by the dimness, his hoodie hanging off his shoulders as though he'd outgrown it or worn it too many times. When he reached the sidewalk, he stopped beneath the flickering street lamp. His face looked pale, even from a distance, drained of the familiar warmth I had come to recognize. His hands were clenched into tight fists at his sides, knuckles faintly visible. He wasn't crying, he wasn't shaking. He simply stood there, breathing hard, staring at the empty road as if it held an answer he desperately needed. He looked smaller than I had ever seen him. Something in my chest twisted sharply. Before I could think about it, I grabbed a sweater from the chair and slipped quietly out of my room. I moved down the hallway, past my parents' closed door, and out into the cold night. The air hit me like a wave, sharp, almost metallic, waking every sense inside me. The street felt too quiet as I made my way toward him. My footsteps on the pavement sounded louder than they should have. He didn't hear me at first. His attention was fixed on the cracks in the sidewalk, like he was afraid to lift his head, afraid of what might come next if he acknowledged the world around him. When I was just a few steps away, I finally whispered his name. He turned slowly. In the dim light, his eyes looked haunted, not wild or afraid, but hollowed in a way I hadn't seen before. His breath came in quick, uneven pulls, and he held himself stiffly, as if any movement might break something inside him. What I started, but the words felt too heavy, too clumsy, so they died on my tongue. He blinked once, then dropped his gaze, shoulders curling inward. "Sorry," he murmured. "I didn't mean to wake anyone." My throat tightened. "You didn't? I heard something." He nodded slightly, though the gesture looked more like a reflex than a response. His fists loosened for a second, then tightened again. I noticed how red the skin around his fingers was, not injured, just strained, like he'd been holding himself together for too long. "Are you okay?" The question left my mouth softly, carried more by breath than voice. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked past me toward my darkened house, then back toward his. The porch light flickered again behind him, casting a trembling shadow across his face. For a moment, I thought he might tell me something honest, something fragile. The truth felt so close I could almost hear it. But when he finally spoke, his voice was small. I just needed air. It wasn't an answer, not really, but it was the closest he had ever come to admitting something was wrong. I stepped closer, slowly giving him space to pull away if he needed to. He didn't. If anything, he seemed relieved to have someone near him, even if he couldn't say it aloud. "Do you want to sit?" I asked gently. He hesitated only a moment before nodding. We walked toward the curb and sat side by side, our knees almost touching. The street lamp above us buzzed faintly, a weak sound that somehow made the silence feel less oppressive. He kept his gaze fixed on his shoes. I kept mine fixed on him. After a long stretch of quiet, he spoke again. "I hate nights like this." The confession was soft, as though he'd whispered it to the pavement instead of me. "Does it happen?" "A lot," I asked carefully. He didn't look up. Sometimes. The word hung between us, weighed down by all the things he wasn't saying. I didn't push. I just let the moment sit there, open and steady, waiting for him to step into it if he wanted to. He pressed his palms against his knees as if grounding himself. I didn't want to stay inside. It felt too much. This time I nodded, slowly, understandingly. His shoulders relaxed by the smallest fraction, barely noticeable, except I'd learned to read him in the quiet spaces. "You can stay out here as long as you need," I said softly. His breath hitched almost imperceptibly. Then finally he looked at me, really looked. And in his eyes I saw a mixture of exhaustion and gratitude tangled together in a way that made my chest tighten. "Aga." "Thanks," he whispered. I didn't take his hand. Not yet. This moment needed its own kind of respect, its own kind of patience. But I shifted just slightly closer, letting the warmth between us travel the small distance without needing to touch. Behind us, the neighborhood slept on, unaware of the quiet collapse happening on its sidewalk. He didn't tell me what happened inside his house that night. He didn't have to. The truth was written everywhere on him, in the tremble of his breath, in the tightness of his fists, in the way he leaned for so slightly toward the safety beside him. And as we sat there beneath the flickering street lamp, one thought pressed into me with growing certainty. Maybe tonight would be the moment. He finally let someone inside the walls he'd built so carefully around himself. Maybe tonight truth had come knocking for both of us. The night after the commotion, the sky hung low with heavy clouds, as if the weather itself was unsure how to settle. I hadn't slept much. Every time I closed my eyes, I kept seeing him standing under the street lamp, small, pale, holding himself together with nothing but sheer will. I'd fallen asleep against the window, forehead resting on the cool glass, waiting to see if he stepped outside again. He didn't. But early the next morning, before the sun fully lifted above the rooftops, I saw him leave his house with a single backpack slung over one shoulder. He walked slowly, like his feet didn't quite trust the ground. Something inside me snapped into motion. I slipped out of my house before I even had time to grab a jacket, calling his name softly across the quiet yard. He turned, startled. His eyes carried that worn-out look from the night before, something fragile flickering behind them. He didn't smile, but he didn't look away either. "Come inside," I said gently. Just for a bit he hesitated. I could almost see the tug of war inside him, the instinct to refuse, the longing to accept the weight of everything he didn't say. He lowered his gaze to the frost-covered grass, and for a moment I thought he would walk past me. But then he nodded. I opened the back door quietly, hoping maybe my parents wouldn't notice. But the moment the cold air swept into the kitchen, my mother appeared from around the corner holding a mug of tea. Her eyebrows rose as she took him in the backpack, the tired expression, the way he stood like he expected to be sent away. "What's going on?" she asked. "He just needs a place to sit," I said. "Just for now." Before she could answer, my father walked in, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. His expression changed the moment he saw the boy standing in our kitchen, surprise first, then concern, then something sharper. "This isn't a shelter," he said. "Where are your parents?" The boy opened his mouth, but no words came out. His fingers tightened around the strap of his backpack. I stepped forward, placing myself partly in front of him without thinking. "Dad, please," I said softly. "Just let him stay a little." But that was all it took for the room to shift. My parents exchanged glances, the kind that held whole conversations in silence. My mother set her mug down too quickly, the ceramic clinking against the counter. My father's jaw tightened and he crossed his arms in a way that meant he was about to say something nobody wanted to hear. "This isn't our responsibility," he said. "Whatever is happening over there, it's not our place to get involved." He's a child, I whispered. He's right here. That doesn't make him ours. The words hung in the air, heavy and cold. The boy beside me seemed to shrink a little more, his shoulders folding inward. He took a small step back, almost imperceptibly, as though preparing to leave before he became a burden. Stop, I said, turning toward him. Don't go. My voice came out more desperate than I intended. His eyes lifted to mine, unsure, apologetic, scared in a quiet way. It broke something in me I hadn't realized was so fragile. Tell us what happened, my mother said gently, though her voice trembled. We can call someone. We can know, he whispered quickly. Please don't. He wasn't loud. He didn't need to be. The rawness in his tone sank straight into the room, pulling all of us into stillness. My mother's face softened. My father looked away, conflicted, as though trying to balance empathy with rules he'd built his whole life around. I just needed somewhere to stand, the boy murmured. Just for a few minutes. I'll go. He shifted the backpack higher, preparing to leave. Something inside me surged forward before my mind caught up. I reached for his hand, not hesitantly, not halfway, but fully, like it was the most natural thing I had ever done. He flinched at the contact just slightly, but didn't pull away. His hand was cold, almost trembling, and he closed his fingers around mine with a quiet, desperate steadiness. He looked at me as though he couldn't understand why someone would choose to stand beside him. My father's voice rose again, frustration threading through it. This is not appropriate. You can't just bring someone in here. There are boundaries. He's not some stranger on the street, I interrupted, my own voice rising despite the fear in my chest. I didn't know how to finish the sentence. He's my friend. He's the boy who knocks softly. He's the one who sits in silence with me. He's the one who held my hand when I couldn't breathe. He's the one who leaves little gifts by the door. He's the one who looks at the world like it's a storm he's trying to survive. None of those descriptions felt big enough. None of them captured the truth. He's someone who matters, I said finally. My mother's eyes softened. My father's expression cracked only a little, but enough to see the strain underneath. He sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. We can let him sit for a bit, my mother said quietly. Just no more than that. And tomorrow we figure something out. The boy's grip tightened on my hand almost imperceptibly. He nodded once, though his eyes stayed cast downward, as if he couldn't bear the idea of causing conflict. I led him to the couch, still holding his hand, and he sat stiffly on the edge of the cushioned backpack, clutched to his chest like armor. My parents whispered in the kitchen, their voices low and anxious, but their words hovered in the air anyway. Responsibility. Rules shouldn't interfere. Child protection. Neighbors will talk. Each phrase made him curl inward a little more. I leaned closer and whispered, You're not intruding. Not with me. He looked up slowly, eyes filled with something fragile and aching, gratitude, confusion, relief, all woven together in one expression that settled deep inside me. Thank you, he whispered. He reached for my hand again, this time deliberately. His fingers slipped around mine, warm now, steadying. It wasn't a gesture of weakness. It wasn't fear. It was connection, a quiet acknowledgement that somehow in a world full of wrong places and wrong people, we had found something that felt right. My father's voice rose once more from the kitchen, but this time it didn't shake me, because I could feel his hand in mine, because he chose to hold on even when everything around him told him not to trust anyone. And as the living room filled with the low hum of adult arguments, I sat beside him and held on, letting the warmth between our hands answer the question I didn't dare ask aloud. What does it mean when two people choose each other even when no one else approves? The days that followed felt strangely suspended, as if time itself wasn't sure how to move forward. Everything in our neighborhood shifted subtly at first, then with a quiet urgency that made the air feel different. Doors opened more often. Neighbors lingered longer on porches. People who once kept to themselves began speaking in low, serious voices. Something unspoken had cracked open, and everyone knew it, even if they pretended not to. I watched it all from my window. His house became a revolving door for adults who never used to visit, a distant aunt I had only seen once at a grocery store, a social worker with a clipboard tucked under her arm, a neighbor who kept patting his shoulder as if reassurance could be handed out like candy. The boy who always tried to slip between cracks suddenly found himself in the center of attention, and nothing about it seemed easy for him. He stood in doorways with that same stiff posture, hands tucked into sleeves, gaze lowered as if the ground might swallow him if he didn't look carefully. I knew he didn't like being watched. He didn't like noise. He didn't like explanations spoken in grown-up voices that didn't match the truth he carried quietly in his chest. But changes were coming anyway. One cold afternoon, while our chimney sent thin trails of smoke into the sky, my mother sat beside me on the couch. She wasn't holding her usual cup of tea. Her hands were empty, folded tightly in her lap. They're arranging something more stable for him, she said gently. Not far, just different. I didn't ask what different meant. I already knew. I'd heard the murmurs through walls, the phone calls made late at night, the sighs exchanged between my parents when they thought I wasn't listening. Everyone wanted to help, or at least they wanted to feel like they were helping. But I wasn't sure they understood him the way I did. What does he want? I whispered. My mother hesitated, eyes softening. Sometimes children don't get to choose. Not fully, but I think he just wants someplace calm, double quotes, calm, safe, steady, the very things he'd never had consistently. The days blended together. I saw less of him, not because he didn't want to be around, but because adults began deciding the schedules, meetings, visits, evaluations, words that sounded important but never kind. Still, he found ways to come. Sometimes he'd appear at my back door after school, standing with his hands in his pockets, offering a small smile as if to say he was still here, still trying, still himself. Sometimes he'd sit with me under the elm tree, drawing circles in the dirt with a stick while the sun dipped behind the rooftops. Sometimes he'd bring nothing, no gifts, no books, no tea, just his presence, quiet and steady. Each time his eyes held the same warmth they always had, a warmth that felt like it belonged to a different kind of family, one made not of names or papers but of moments that grew between us like wild vines. One late afternoon he came to return a scarf I'd lent him. The sky was painted in pale orange, and the air carried the scent of distant chimney smoke. He didn't knock this time. He just waited at the fence, looking at me with that soft uncertainty that made him who he was. You leaving? I asked, heart settling painfully into my chest. Not far, he said. Just staying somewhere else for a while. He didn't sound sad. He didn't sound happy either. Just tired, but in the kind of way that hinted at relief beneath the exhaustion. I stepped closer. Do you want to? He looked down at the scarf in his hands, fingers brushing the edge. I think I want quiet. The good kind. It was the first time he'd spoken so directly about wanting something for himself. Not what adults wanted, not what he was supposed to accept. Just what he longed for, a quiet that didn't hurt, a silence that didn't threaten. When will you visit? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He met my eyes then, and for the first time in days a true smile lifted his face, small but honest. Whenever they let me, whenever I can. I'll come back, I believed him. Weeks passed. The snow finally arrived, soft, feathery flakes that coated the street in a thin white layer. His footsteps appeared one morning in the fresh snow leading to our back door. He stayed for half an hour that day, just long enough to sit on the couch and tell me about his new room, which had a window that didn't rattle and a lamp that worked properly. Do you like it? I asked. He nodded. It feels quiet. Not lonely, not empty, just quiet. He visited less often after that, sometimes once a week, sometimes twice, sometimes not at all. But every time he stepped through the door, something in me settled. His eyes still softened when he saw me. His smile still carried warmth. His hand still reached for mine if the room grew tense or too many voices filled the air. Our bond didn't fade. It changed shape, maybe stretched thinner across the new distance, but it stayed, like thread between two windows on opposite sides of a street. Seasons turned. Winter melted into early spring, mud replacing snow. Spring slipped softly into summer, long days stretching out like golden threads, and through it all he came when he could. Always with that same quiet presence, always with that same gentle steadiness. One evening as the sun dipped low behind the elm tree, he sat beside me in the grass, leaning back on his palms. The air smelled like warm soil and the last breath of daylight. I felt the urge to ask him something I'd been holding for months. Do you think we'll stay close? I asked. His head turned slightly. His eyes, soft, thoughtful, searched mine. Then he nodded, slow and certain. Yeah, he whispered. Some connections don't disappear. They just change their shape. I let those words settle into the spaces inside me where worry had lived. Family wasn't always the ones you were born with. It wasn't always paperwork or promises or shared last names. Sometimes it was simply the hand that reached for yours when the night felt too long, the boy who knocked softly. The warmth that stayed even when the world shifted. As the sky darkened into a soft blue and the first stars peeked through, I looked at him and realized something I should have known all along. We were stitched to each other, not by obligation, but by choice. By quiet. By understanding. By the kind of bond that grows in silence and survives the spaces in between. And as the wind moved gently through the branches above us, I wondered, not with fear but with a steady kind of hope, would the quiet we chose be enough to carry us through whatever came next?